Hi, these are the most interesting historical photos that I could find. Let's go! Black smoke and fast flames swallowed the Branch Davidian compound at Mount Carmel on April 19, 1993, ending the 51-day Waco siege. By the end of that day, 76 men, women, and children at the site had died. Japanese students pushed back riot police with wooden boards during a protest against the Vietnam War at Haneda Airport in November 1967. The protest was part of a wider student movement in Japan against support for the United States war in Vietnam. A freed Jewish prisoner at Dachau grabs a captured guard on April 29, 1945, the day United States troops entered the camp. Dachau opened in 1933 and became one of Nazi Germany's first concentration camps. A Russian convict from the Nerchinsk hard labor camps was photographed in 1891 with prison marks on his face and back. The letters identified him as a Siberian hard labor prisoner, and the image was made by Alexei Kuznetsov, a former exile who later documented the camps. On April 18, 1926, Mauna Loa sent 5 lava flows toward Hupaloa on the Kona coast of Hawaii, slowly moving toward the sea. Police guarded the highway as large crowds came to watch, and strong earthquakes were reported during the advance. After his 1945 capture, former Japanese Prime Minister Hideki Tojo wore dentures secretly drilled with the Morse code message, "Remember Pearl Harbor." American dentist George Clark Foster hid the phrase inside the set before fitting them. Taken in February 1937, this aerial view captured Da Nang, a fascist Italian camp in Italian Somaliland. Official visitors reported severe conditions there, and the death rate reached 51%. In 1934, Mae West was photographed learning to handle a Tommy gun after a holdup, and repeated threats left her on edge. 7 years earlier, a censorship case had sent her to jail and made her one of the most famous women in America. Rocky Marciano landed the title-winning punch on Jersey Joe Walcott in 1952 and became heavyweight champion of the world. He retired with 49 wins and 0 losses, and 43 of those wins came by knockout. Sergeant Spano and his military dog Lobo complete a parachute jump over Da Nang, Vietnam, in August 1968. Dogs like Lobo were trained to jump with handlers and then help detect ambushes, tunnels, and hidden movement after landing. Around 1900 in Los Angeles, tourists could watch an alligator slide down a ramp at one of the city's early reptile farms. The farm used live shows with baby and adult alligators to turn the animals into public entertainment. The Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building stands torn open after the Oklahoma City attack on April 19, 1995, one of the deadliest such events in United States history. The truck explosion left 168 people dead. Soviet soldiers pose outside the ruined Reichstag in Berlin in 1945, just after the fall of the city. The Reichstag had been Germany's parliament building since 1894 and stood heavily damaged by the time Berlin fell. After 23 days on the front at Cape Gloucester in January 1944, exhausted United States Marines sat in the mud just after returning from the line. The battle on New Britain was fought through swamp ground, thick jungle. In 1967, a United States Marine used a flamethrower during fighting in Vietnam, a weapon built for close-range attacks. It was used to clear bunkers, trenches, and thick cover where ordinary rifles were less effective. United States Army Corporal Larry Matinsk passes cigarettes through the fence to newly freed prisoners at Munich-Allach, Germany on April 30, 1945. Allach was part of the Dachau camp system, and American troops reached it only 8 days before Germany surrendered in Europe. On Okinawa in April 1945, Japanese forces hid a Type 97 grenade inside a cabbage, turning an ordinary field into a hidden trap. The Battle of Okinawa lasted 82 days and became one of the largest and costliest campaigns in the Pacific. Marilyn Monroe poses for a live sketch in Atlantic City on September 2, 1952, during the Miss America pageant. The drawing was made by Miss Indiana Ann Harriet Richard, while Monroe served as the event's Grand Marshal. This street in Dublin shows the aftermath of the Dublin and Monaghan bombings on May 17, 1974, the deadliest attack of the Troubles. 4 car bombs killed 34 people across Dublin and Monaghan that day. In 1985, Reinhold Messner hung on Annapurna's unclimbed northwest face, a frozen wall few climbers even tried to enter. He kept going after a storm on April 24th on a mountain that rises to 8,091 meters. One of only 6 known surviving life jackets from Titanic still exists. A plain cloth vest from the ship lost in 1912. So many people wore them that night, but almost none survived to reach a museum case. In the 1920s, school cheerleaders often looked like this, with men leading the chants on the field. Before World War II, cheerleading in the United States was mostly male, and the shift toward female squads came later. Harry Houdini became famous for escaping a straitjacket while hanging upside down, often in less than 3 minutes. A straitjacket unknown to the public for years was sold at Christie's in 2011 for $46,980. In May 1945, a United States B-17 bomber drops food over the ruined Schiphol Airport during Operation Chowhound, a relief mission for civilians in the Netherlands. The flights brought bread, flour, and other supplies to a country pushed to the edge of famine at the end of the war. Before he became the Hall of Fame coach of the Dallas Cowboys, Tom Landry flew 30 missions as co-pilot of a B-17 bomber during World War II. He served from 1942 to 1945, long before he led Dallas to 20 straight winning seasons. On May 11, 1962, an underwater atomic test sent a huge white water column into the Pacific during Operation Dominic. The United States carried out the shot off the California coast at the height of the Cold War. In May 1945, the B-17 Stella dropped food over the ruined Schiphol airfield during Operation Chowhound, a relief mission for hungry civilians in the Netherlands. After running out of fuel and making a forced landing near Litchett Minster, the bomber was repaired with new engines. United States soldiers flattened into the wrecked ground on Leyte on October 30, 1944, trying to stay below Japanese fire. The battle for Leyte opened the campaign that brought Allied forces back to the Philippines. American soldiers cross a river in Vietnam with rifles and full packs, moving through open water with almost no cover. In tropical fighting, crossings like this could soak weapons, radios, and supplies before the next clash even began. Around 1918, a United States soldier with a bandaged jaw receives field treatment near the front during World War I. By the end of 1918, more than 4 million Americans had entered military service in that war. In 1977, Tony Kiritsis forced a live press conference in Indianapolis, while keeping mortgage broker Richard Hall trapped beside him with a shotgun wired to Hall's neck. The standoff lasted 63 hours and ended only after Hall was released and Kiritsis surrendered. 2 Australian Lewis gunners of the 1st Battalion hold position near Ypres on November 1, 1917, surrounded by shattered trees and churned earth. The Third Battle of Ypres had already been raging for 4 months, and the Lewis gun gave infantry a rare source of fast-moving fire. In 1944, a woman accused of helping the German occupation sits as her head is shaved in public after liberation. Around 20,000 accused women in France were marked this way during the post-war purge. British troops crowd onto a small raft with a field gun during the Gallipoli campaign in 1915, balancing on open water as they pull back from the shore. The Allied evacuation was completed in January 1916, after the campaign had cost both sides hundreds of thousands of casualties. Australian troops at Gallipoli use a periscope rifle in 1915, a strange trench weapon built so a man could aim and fire without lifting his head above the sandbags. Australian soldier William Beach created the design in 1915. In February 1937, an Alabama farmer walks home with his purchases balanced in both arms on a muddy country road. The photo comes from the Great Depression, when many rural families still relied on dirt roads and long trips for basic supplies. In 1905, a fisherman in the Danube Delta raises a giant lift net from a narrow boat, turning still water into a trap. The delta is where the Danube breaks into a maze of channels before reaching the Black Sea. In 1936, a driver stands beside his car during a street registration check as a crowd gathers around the curb. By that time, number plates, papers, and roadside checks were becoming part of everyday road control as car traffic grew. On June 26, 1941, members of Finland's Lotta Svard Volunteer Corps scanned the sky from a rooftop post, turning an ordinary building into an air warning station. Lotta Svard later reached about 240,000 members. In Korea in 1950, a wounded United States ambulance driver breaks down after a blast hit his Jeep, and his friend did not survive. David Douglas Duncan photographed the scene for Life magazine during the Korean War. A black protester in Chicago in 1941 holds a sign demanding the same work rights at home that black men were given in military service. The message targeted Bowman Dairy and tied job discrimination directly to World War II labor and service. In 1950, model Ginger Stanley demonstrates an underwater camera at Silver Springs, Florida, holding a bulky metal housing beneath the clear water. Long before small waterproof cameras, underwater photography often relied on heavy sealed boxes like this to keep the lens dry. In 1956, this man was known as the last living witness to the moment Abraham Lincoln was shot. He had been inside Ford's Theater in 1865 as a small child. In 1944, a Civil Air Patrol student pilot relaxes on an aircraft at Silver Lake Airfield near Baker, California. During the World War II, the Civil Air Patrol trained young flyers and supported aviation work across the United States. After the liberation of Mauthausen in 1945, former prisoners in striped uniforms gather around a small fire and pan inside the camp. More than 90,000 people did not survive the Mauthausen camp system. A Marauder bomber burns over Toulon, France, in 1944 after a direct hit from German anti-aircraft fire. The Martin B-26 Marauder carried a crew of 6 and became one of the main American medium bombers in Europe. At the Monson Motor Lodge Pool in St. Augustine on June 18, 1964, a plainclothes officer moved in on black and white civil rights protesters who entered a segregated pool. The protest came 14 days before the Civil Rights Act of 1964 became law. In Madrid in 1959, priests in long cassocks played football on a dusty seminary field, and one goalkeeper launched himself toward the post. The photo was taken at a seminary school showing clergy still playing the game in full religious dress. Joseph Stalin is photographed walking through Moscow in 1930 among ordinary people instead of a formal state scene. By 1930, he had already become the dominant ruler of the Soviet Union. In October 1939, a regimental mascot dog posed with round glasses, a pipe, and a French Adrien M26 helmet. The Adrien M26 had been standard French military headgear since 1926. Sergeant Charlton Chapman of the 761st Tank Battalion looks up from an M4 Sherman in France on November 5, 1944. The 761st was one of the first black United States tank battalions to enter combat, and Chapman was lost 4 days later. On the Bowery in New York in 1910, a young bootblack kneels on the sidewalk and shines a customer's shoe from a small wooden box. In that era, the Bowery was lined with cheap hotels, saloons, and street jobs, and boys often earned coins by polishing shoes. A woman in a hat walks through the dust-covered streets of Lower Manhattan on September 11, 2001, as smoke and stunned people fill the block. The photo was taken near the World Trade Center area on the day the towers fell. At 18, Johnny Miles of Nova Scotia won the 30th Boston Marathon on April 19, 1926. His victory came with a new world record, making the teenager the fastest man ever over the marathon distance at that moment. At Obninsk in 1964, engineers stand beside the reactor of the first power plant in the world built to send nuclear electricity into a public grid. The station began regular power production on June 27, 1954, in the Soviet Union and generated about 5 megawatts. An Austro-Hungarian soldier in 1915 carries a rare Schutzschild, a metal rifle shield built to cover the head, chest, and legs in open fire. Very few details about these shields survived, and no confirmed example is known to exist today. American soldiers in Seoul laughed during a Bob Hope show on October 23, 1950, in the first months of the Korean War. Hope went on to spend nearly 50 years entertaining United States troops overseas. Soviet soldiers moved through the wrecked center of Stalingrad in 1943 after the city was retaken from German forces. Months of fighting had reduced whole blocks to shells and made Stalingrad one of the most destroyed cities of World War II. West Virginia miners paused deep inside a coal tunnel beside the narrow track that carried coal to the surface. Before modern safety rules, work like this meant low ceilings, bad air, and the risk of cave-ins. In 1916, the Austro-Hungarian Navy tested the Versuchs Gleitboot, an experimental craft that rode just above the water on an air cushion. It reached about 33 knots, but was never adopted because steering and engine reliability were poor. In 1910, Thomas Edison posed beside an electric car built for a 1,000-mile endurance run using his new storage battery. At that time, electric cars were still real rivals to gasoline cars, and Edison was trying to make them go farther on a single charge. A reserve officer of Italy's Black Shirt militia turns toward the camera in Rome during the 1937 anniversary parade. By 1937, the Black Shirts had already been folded into Mussolini's state as an official national force. Italian soldiers crouch behind a machine gun on the Albanian border with Greece in February 1941. The photo comes from the failed Italian push into Greece, a winter campaign that stalled and exposed major weaknesses in Mussolini's army. Boys in Balila uniforms crowd around a guest, showing how Italy turned youth groups into a public tool for shaping children. Balila trained boys in marching, sport, and strict discipline, so loyalty to the state began early. San Francisco residents watch huge fires swallow the city after the April 18, 1906 earthquake. More than 3,000 people died, and about 80% of San Francisco burned. President Dwight Eisenhower playfully holds Rocky Marciano's fist in a photo that joins politics and boxing in one frame. Marciano retired in 1956 with 49 wins, 0 losses, and remains the only heavyweight champion to leave the sport undefeated and without a draw. In 1968, Jack Nicholson sits with the Monkees during filming of Head, the movie he co-wrote and co-produced. The film failed in theaters at first, then later became a cult classic. Stage performer CeeLo poses with a cigar and axe in a publicity photo that matched his wood-chopping act. Born Stan Barrett, he became famous for doing stage stunts, despite having hands formed close to his shoulders. Fannie Mills sits in a carefully arranged studio portrait, but the huge shoes beneath her dress pull the eye at once. Milroy's disease caused severe swelling in her legs and feet, and performing gave her rare financial independence. Jane Barnell, known on stage as Lady Olga, became famous in America for her beard and circus career. Born in 1876, she entered circus life as a child and later appeared in the 1932 film Freaks. An FBI agent stands in the smoking ruins of Mount Carmel near Waco on April 19, 1993, after the final day of the Branch Davidian siege. The 51-day standoff ended with 76 Branch Davidians not surviving. In March 1946, Leonardo Cianciulli was photographed during an interview with psychiatrist Filippo Saporito at the Criminal Psychiatric Hospital in Aversa, Italy. She had been convicted of killing 3 women and was being held there after the case. Early 20th century Germany had youth hiking groups that looked simple in photos, but often mixed uniforms, ritual, and intense male bonding. Some strands were monarchist and anti-feminist. Czech eccentric Josef Menšik lived alone in a crumbling 13th century castle and called himself Sir Joseph. When German tanks approached in 1938, he put on armor, took a sword and lance, and rode out to meet them. In 1936, a family rides along a Moroccan beach on a motorcycle with a wicker sidecar, with even the dog packed in for the trip. The photo captures 5 passengers on one small machine, turning a simple beach ride into a rare family travel scene. In 1940 at Krasnogorsk, the Soviet Union sent trains loaded with timber, grain, and ore toward Germany. The photo catches a quiet moment in the short period when 2 future enemies were still trading on a massive scale. In 1919, an American soldier posed at Château de Rochefort-en-Terre in France with captured gear from World War I. The war had ended only months earlier, and thousands of American troops were still in France, waiting to go home. In May 1919, soldiers stand at the gate of Fort Oglethorpe, where enemy prisoners and civilian internees were held during and just after World War I. Between 1917 and 1920, about 4,000 men were confined there. At the 1936 Berlin Olympics, a German officer posed with athletes from the American and Indian teams in one striking frame. The games were staged by Nazi Germany and opened only 3 years before World War II began. In 1980, passengers sat beneath a giant Aeroflot jet model in the waiting hall at Vnukovo Airport, one of the most striking details in the room. Vnukovo was one of Moscow's main airports, and Aeroflot was the state airline that carried passengers across the Soviet Union. On December 15, 1977, patrolmen Harvey Spiesman and William Thomas walked a foot patrol in North Philadelphia in matching leather police coats. The photo captures a street-level police beat from the late 1970s, with both officers identified by name. Japanese soldiers hand over their weapons to a Red Army officer during the Manchurian Campaign in 1945. In just 23 days, the Soviet offensive broke the Kwantung Army and sent more than 500,000 Japanese troops into captivity. In 1924, hooded Ku Klux Klan members posed around the John Harvard statue at Harvard University in a photo marked Harvard Class Day. The scene comes from the decade when the Klan claimed millions of members across the United States. In 1929, Vice President Charles Curtis, the first Native American to hold that office, receives a peace pipe from Lakota man Red Tomahawk. Red Tomahawk was known for his role in the 1890 death of Lakota leader Sitting Bull. In 1973, a traffic policeman stands on Tiananmen Square in Beijing, directing bicycles beneath giant portraits of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. The image was taken during the Cultural Revolution, when political symbols towered over everyday life in China. In 1974, this snack display paired cigarettes, milk, and Cadbury Dairy Milk in one everyday still life. The image captures a time when cigarettes could still be presented beside ordinary food products in mainstream advertising. In 1965, at the International Radio Exhibition in Stuttgart, West Germany, a woman tests an early picture phone that let callers see each other on a small screen. The device combined a telephone and live video more than 40 years before smartphones made video calls common. In 1956, 2 Bedouin riders pose on horseback in a dry, open landscape, with one holding a parasol against the sun. The photo captures a traditional desert travel scene from a region where horses, robes, and carried weapons still shaped daily movement. Sandra Bullock poses as a high school cheerleader in 1982, years before Hollywood made her a global star. The photo captures her at 18, long before Speed and The Blind Side turned her into one of the most recognizable actresses in America. In 1942, a fisherman and his family in Provincetown, Massachusetts, gather tightly around a table radio in their living room. During the World War II, home radios carried news, music, and war updates into rooms like this every day. Sophia Loren sits beside her mother on the set of More Than a Miracle in 1967. The film was released that year and paired Loren with Omar Sharif. On January 27, 1945, Master Sergeant Roddy Edmonds refused a German order to single out Jewish American prisoners of war and answered, "We are all Jews here." His defiance protected about 300 Jewish soldiers. An Italian immigrant woman sits for a portrait at Ellis Island around 1906, the main gateway for newcomers entering the United States. Between 1892 and 1954, about 12 million immigrants passed through Ellis Island. In 1973, Bobby Onko raised his rifle after a ceasefire at Wounded Knee, becoming one of the most recognizable faces of the occupation. The photo was later turned into a famous Remember Wounded Knee poster and became a lasting symbol of Native protest. Anthony Moynihan, later known as Baron Moynihan, poses with Playboy bunnies in a photo that matches his British Playboy image. He married 5 times, left Britain in 1970 after a fraud case, and later settled in the Philippines. On August 28, 1945, Captain Nagasaki addressed his Japanese troops in the Marikina watershed after receiving orders to surrender. The scene came 13 days after Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. In April 1945, an American M4 mortar carrier named Lucia stood in front of Lemgo's ornate Hexenberger Meisterhaus in Germany, mixing armored war with a centuries-old facade. The photo was taken in the final month of the war in Europe. War correspondent Ernie Pyle sits with American tankers on Ayashima in April 1945, still reporting from the front where ordinary soldiers trusted him most. He died there on April 18, 1945, only days after landing with the 77th Infantry Division. A whole row of San Francisco buildings slumped sideways after the April 18, 1906 earthquake, while people crowd the street to see the damage. The 7.9 quake lasted about 42 seconds, and the fires that followed destroyed about 80% of the city. A French soldier stands guard in a gas mask at Verdun in 1916, looking almost inhuman against the ruined earth. The Battle of Verdun lasted about 10 months and became one of the longest battles of World War I. On June 21, 1942, Japanese naval troops of the Miyazaki Unit ran through the surf onto Natuna Island during Japan's push across Southeast Asia. The force had been reorganized from the Yokosuka 2nd Special Naval Landing Force. In 1938, Nicholas Winton is pictured with one of the children he helped move out of Czechoslovakia before Nazi rule closed in. He organized trains to Britain and saved 669 children, and the full story stayed largely unknown until 1988. In 1940, women at Rockefeller Center took a roller skating lesson while a crowd stopped to watch from the edge of the rink. The photo catches one student mid-stumble, turning a simple afternoon class into a perfect New York street scene. On April 18, 1926, more than 10,000 people crowded Victoria Station to welcome Australian tourists arriving in London. They had landed at Dover that morning and rode into the city on a Tilling-Stevens gasoline-electric bus. In 1985, Soviet soldiers watch from a hillside as attack helicopters strike Mujahideen positions in Afghanistan. The Soviet-Afghan War lasted from 1979 to 1989 and became one of the Soviet Union's longest foreign wars. In 1988, David Koresh talks with Waco Tribune-Herald reporters at Mount Carmel during a struggle for control inside the Branch Davidian group. The visit came before he fully took over, and the newspaper story showed him and his followers in a positive light. Near Nammering in 1945, an American soldier shows German civilians a sign marking 800 prisoners shot by the SS. In the background, local people were forced to walk past exhumed remains from the mass grave. Eamon Goth surveys Plasov near Krakow on horseback in 1943 or 1944 while serving as the camp commandant. Plasov began in 1942 and later became a concentration camp in German-occupied Poland. British soldiers stand guard at the giant oil refinery in Abadan, Persia, during World War II. Abadan had one of the largest refineries in the world, and its fuel was vital for Allied ships, planes, and vehicles. Queen Victoria poses in 1882, 45 years after taking the British throne in 1837. During her reign, Britain became the dominant empire of the age, and she was declared Empress of India in 1876. A giant statue of Kim Il-sung towers over Pyongyang in this 1980s photo, turning one man into the center of the whole square. The monument was unveiled in 1972 for his 60th birthday and became one of North Korea's most famous symbols. In 1943 in Russia, a Red Army soldier holds and feeds a baby after the child's mother did not survive the fighting. By that stage of the war, whole villages across the Soviet Union had been shattered, and soldiers often found civilians left behind in the ruins. In 1975, about 20,000 people marched in New York after Chinese-American Peter Yu was beaten and arrested by police. The protest became one of the largest Asian American demonstrations in United States history and turned Chinatown into the center of a civil rights fight. These are items found in Abraham Lincoln's pockets on the night of April 14, 1865, including his spectacles, a pocket knife, and small personal objects. One of the strangest details is that he was also carrying newspaper clippings about himself. The locomotive Old Nashville pulled Abraham Lincoln's funeral train in 1865 on its journey from Washington to Springfield, Illinois. The train passed through 7 states, and huge crowds gathered along the tracks to watch one of the largest public farewells in United States history. These 1920s school gymnasts trained in long bloomers and sailor-style uniforms, a look closer to a stage costume than modern sportswear. Early girls' school athletics still followed strict modesty rules, so even exercise clothes had to cover most of the body. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, made up mostly of Japanese-American soldiers, became one of the most decorated units in United States military history. It earned 21 Medals of Honor and more than 4,000 Purple Hearts while fighting in Italy, France, and Germany. Vietnam prisoner of war. Doug Hegdahl fooled his captors by acting uneducated and harmless, so they let him move around the camp more freely. He secretly memorized details on about 256 fellow prisoners and gave that information to the United States after his release. School children stand outside homes of black families after the Chicago race riot of 1919. During Chicago's Red Summer, 38 people died, and white crowds damaged homes across black neighborhoods. In February 1945, Army nurse Dorothy Davis stands with her sister after surviving years of internment at Santo Tomas in the Philippines. She was one of the Angels of Bataan, the nurses captured after Bataan and Corregidor fell. General George S. Patton's flag-draped coffin is carried through Luxembourg Station in 1945 on the way to burial. He had asked to rest beside his soldiers, and he was buried at the Luxembourg American Cemetery instead of at West Point. In February 1942, British troops marched with a white flag after the fall of Singapore, one of the worst defeats in British military history. In just 70 days, Japanese forces overran Malaya and Singapore and captured about 130,000 Allied troops. United States medics of the 4th Infantry Division treat a wounded soldier in the Wehe-Bachtal Valley of Hürtgen Forest, Germany, on November 18, 1944. The Hürtgen battle lasted from September 1944 to February 1945 in dense forest near the German border. In Oslo in 1940, this storefront sign read, "Palestine calls. Jews not tolerated in Norway," turning a city street into open anti-Jewish propaganda. It appeared in the first year of Nazi occupation before the deportation of Norwegian Jews began in 1942. At Vimy Ridge in April 1917, horses of the 20th Battery hauled shells through deep mud to guns near the front. The Canadian Corps took the ridge in 4 days, and moving ammunition like this was critical to the attack. In Texas in 1936, the married daughter of a migrant worker prepares a meal beside a stove inside a rough camp shelter. The photo comes from the Great Depression, when many farm families lived in temporary camps and followed seasonal work across the state. In 1977, a battered butcher's shop in Byker Tyneside stood with hand-painted meat signs above a woman and child in the doorway. Chris Killip made the photo during the years when old working-class streets in northeast England were being erased by redevelopment. Around 1939, a Boeing 314 Clipper flying boat sat at Puget Sound, one of the giant aircraft built for Pan American's ocean routes. Only 12 were made between 1938 and 1941, and they opened the first regular transoceanic passenger flights for the airline. On Saipan in 1944, American Marines paused with a captured Japanese bicycle in the middle of the island campaign. Saipan fell on July 9, 1944, and the island later became a major base for B-29 raids on Japan. In January 1939, a little girl rests on bags during the evacuation of Barcelona as civilians fled the city. Barcelona fell to Franco's forces on January 26, 1939, and the defeat helped break the Spanish Republic. United States soldiers of the 60th Infantry Regiment move into Sprimont, Belgium on September 9, 1944, using a Sherman tank of the 746th Tank Battalion as cover. The advance came just 3 months after the Normandy landings. Major Inaoka raises his hands on Iwo Jima on April 1, 1945, in a rare image of a Japanese officer surrendering during the Pacific War. More than 6,800 Americans did not survive the battle, and nearly all of the island's Japanese defenders were lost. On October 10, 1912, RMS Olympic stood in refit after the sinking of Titanic had forced major safety changes on her sister ship. Olympic returned with more lifeboats and other upgrades, and she stayed in service until 1935. In August 1946, blacksmiths worked inside the Pocahontas Corporation mine shop in Tazewell County, Virginia, shaping hot metal beside the forge. Even after World War II, coal mines still depended on shops like this to repair and make iron parts on site. In 1865, Henry Wirtz is read the warrant for his execution after the American Civil War. He had commanded Andersonville Prison in Georgia, where nearly 13,000 Union prisoners died. Lubo Chupich smiles in chains on May 9, 1942, in one of the most startling resistance photos of World War II. He was photographed only minutes before his execution by Italian occupation forces in Montenegro. Aaron Bush and boarder Jane Wolfe were photographed in Oklahoma in 1914, both caught laughing in the same instant. The image was taken only 7 years after Oklahoma became a state in 1907, which makes this relaxed, everyday moment feel even rarer. In June 1941, a worker's wife in Erie, Pennsylvania, washes clothes by hand beside a metal tub inside a modest home. John Vachon photographed the scene at a time when many households still cleaned laundry with tubs, soap, and hot water instead of machines. On July 29, 1944, American infantrymen moved through the wrecked cathedral area of Coutances, France, while German 88mm fire still reaches the town. Coutances was taken during the Allied breakout from Normandy, just days after the fall of St. Lo. In December 1950 at the Chosin Reservoir, life photographer David Douglas Duncan captured a United States Marine wrapped against the cold with a can of food in his hand. When Duncan asked what he wanted for Christmas, the Marine answered with 3 words that became the photo's title: "Give me tomorrow." In 1910 in Maitland, future boxing star Les Darcy posed in a blacksmith shop doorway with tongs and a horseshoe, looking more like a smith than a champion. He was about 15 years old then, years before becoming Australia's biggest boxing draw in the 1910s. In May 1862 at Cumberland Landing, Virginia, a group of formerly enslaved people sat together after reaching Union lines during the Civil War. The photo was taken months before the Emancipation Proclamation. Madrid boxing belt champions posed together in 1935, packed shoulder to shoulder in a tense group portrait before the camera. The photo was taken by Spanish photographer Santos Ubero only 1 year before the Spanish Civil War began. Theron Boyd cooked supper in his Vermont home in 1977, working over an iron stove with a pan in his hands. An oil lamp and wall clock sit behind him, and the same stove heats both the room and the meal. During the 1965 Selma Voting Rights March in Alabama, a young black marcher wore "Vote" across his forehead so the message could not be missed. The Selma marches helped push the United States to pass the Voting Rights Act later that same year. In 1947, activist Stetson Kennedy posed in Ku Klux Klan robes after secretly infiltrating the group to learn its rituals and code words. He passed its internal details to the outside world, helping expose how the organization operated behind the mask. Flight Sergeant James Hyde smiles beside mascot dog Dingo in a rare, calm moment beside his aircraft. His Spitfire was brought down near Nijmegen, Holland, on September 25, 1944, and he did not return. In 1921, a poor rural girl heads to Buckeye School barefoot, carrying a tin pail in one hand and a book in the other. Lewis Hine made images like this to document how poverty shaped childhood in the United States. These 2,000-year-old Roman eye medicine pills were found in a shipwreck, still intact enough for scientists to test what was inside. Analysis showed zinc, beeswax, and pine resin, making them the first complete ancient medicinal recipe ever recovered. In April 1927, Mae West sat in a New York courtroom after being convicted over her stage play, Sex. She received 10 days in jail and a $500 fine, and the case helped launch her rise to national fame. In 1864, Union Private Marshal Sherman posed beside the 28th Virginia battle flag captured by the 1st Minnesota at Gettysburg. The flag was taken in July 1863 during one of the most decisive battles of the American Civil War. In 1947, activist Stetson Kennedy posed in Ku Klux Klan robes after infiltrating the group to learn its hidden rules and passwords. He later exposed those secrets to the public, helping strip away the fear and mystery the organization relied on. Anne Frank was 13 when her family went into hiding in Amsterdam on July 6, 1942, after Nazi persecution closed in around Dutch Jews. She remained hidden for 761 days until August 4, 1944, and her diary later became one of the most famous personal records of World War II. Hans and Sophie Scholl sit with Christoph Probst in Munich in November 1941 while helping build the White Rose, a student resistance group in Nazi Germany. The group later spread anti-Nazi leaflets, and all three were put to death in 1943. In 1873, 15-year-old Joseph Axford was photographed in Wandsworth Prison in London after being arrested for stealing a blanket. He was sentenced to 2 weeks of hard labor, a stark reminder of how quickly poor children could end up in prison in Victorian England. Vera Lee Dickinson ran a doll shop in New York, but federal investigators later linked her business to money from Japanese sources in 1941. By 1943, they had found up to $15,000 tied to Japanese officials. A British soldier points out a German woman after she reportedly laughed during a forced screening of film showing Nazi camp conditions. In 1945, Allied authorities made many German civilians watch this footage to confront what had been done in the camps. Cudjoe Kazula Lewis sits on his porch in 1920, one of the last living survivors of the Atlantic slave trade. He was brought to Alabama on the Clotilda in 1860, the last known slave ship to reach the United States. David Vetter, known as Bubble Boy, was born in 1971 with severe combined immunodeficiency and lived inside a sterile plastic chamber to stay alive. Even ordinary germs could be dangerous for him, so every object that entered his world had to be specially cleaned. In 1947, President Harry Truman led a workout on the deck of the USS Missouri at age 63. The same ship had hosted Japan's surrender in 1945. Thousands of men at San Quentin sat in strict rows for a concert, turning the yard into a giant human grid. San Quentin opened in 1852 and is California's oldest prison. Friedrich Gösling's 1895 Reichstag design for Berlin gave the parliament a giant Gothic spire that dwarfed every part of the building. It was never built, and the real Reichstag had already opened in 1894 with a completely different shape. Red markers cover the western Pacific so densely that major sea routes almost vanish under them. Historians usually estimate Japan lost about 2,000 to 3,000 ships in World War II, including about 350 to 400 naval vessels and about 2,000 merchant ships. An 1870 operating room looked shockingly bare, with a patient on a table, a few doctors, and no gloves or masks in sight. Antiseptic surgery was still new, and carbolic acid entered medical use only after Joseph Lister promoted it in 1867. American soldiers walk in a long line with their hands raised after being taken prisoner during the Ardennes Offensive in 1944. The battle began in December 1944 and became the largest United States battle on the Western Front in World War II. In 1915, this Austro-Hungarian reconnaissance aircraft carried 10 Mauser C-96 pistols in a single mount for air defense. Early World War I aircraft entered combat before mounted guns became standard, so some crews relied on rifles and pistols instead. This 1899 photograph shows the car from Britain's first recorded motor crash, in which both occupants later died. Driver Edwin Sewell died at once, and passenger Major James Richard died 3 days later after a wheel failed on a downhill road. Commission Exhibit 399 became one of the most studied objects in modern American history after the 1963 attack on President John F. Kennedy. Investigators said the bullet also passed through Governor John Connally and was later found on a hospital stretcher. In 1916, rows of artificial legs filled this workshop, turning recovery into assembly line work. The photo was taken in the middle of World War I, when factories were making replacement limbs for large numbers of soldiers. In 1952, this Daily News front page turned Christine Jorgensen into one of the first transgender Americans to become national news. She returned to New York in December 1952 after a series of operations in Denmark, and newspapers across the United States put her story on page 1. Crowds in Trafalgar Square watched Apollo 11 land on the moon, live in July 1969. An estimated 600 million people watched worldwide, making it one of the largest live broadcasts in history. Nationalist troops stepped through the ruins of Madrid homes in 1937 during the Spanish Civil War. The war lasted from 1936 to 1939, and Madrid became one of its main frontline cities. Abraham Lincoln sat for this life mask in 1860, creating one of the most exact records of his face before he became president. A second mask was made in 1865, and the two casts show how 4 years in office changed his appearance. On March 11, 1923, hooded Ku Klux Klan members sat openly inside Grace Methodist Episcopal Church in New Jersey during a Sunday night service. 40 members were welcomed into the church, showing how openly the Klan spread in parts of the United States during the 1920s. In 1979, Tsen Hai Sun and Hae Gai Sun exchanged rings while hanging by their hair beneath a helicopter in West Germany. The ceremony happened in mid-air, with both partners suspended above the ground for the wedding. In July 1945, workers prepare the Gadget in the New Mexico desert just before the Trinity test. The test began at 5:29 in the morning on July 16th, 1945, and became the first nuclear test in history. A Whitechapel street boy became one of the faces linked to Thomas Barnardo's campaign for homes and schools for children in East London. Barnardo opened his first children's home in 1870, and his work later reached thousands of children in Britain. A rare angle captures Muhammad Ali and Sonny Liston seconds before one of boxing's most famous first rounds in Lewiston, Maine, on May 25, 1965. Ali won in round 1, and the image taken moments later became one of the most iconic sports photographs ever made. Children step out into the snow at Auschwitz on January 27, 1945, the day Soviet troops reached the camp complex. About 7,000 sick and exhausted prisoners were still alive in Auschwitz, Birkenau, and Monowitz when the camp was liberated. On December 14, 1903, Wilbur Wright lies beside the damaged Wright Flyer after a failed trial at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. 3 days later, Orville Wright flew the repaired plane for 12 seconds and about 120 feet in the first sustained powered flight. I will be very grateful for your subscription to the channel. Every day I try to tell you about such interesting historical photos.